So here we're at it again. I've missed you, and I'm sure you've missed me, because we're gonna continue on our M&EZ monitoring and evaluation made easy. And that why? Because everyone should know this is so applicable to everything that we do in our lives. So today we're going to be talking about designs, and we're going to borrow from research, and so we're going to call this chapter 6 research and evaluation designs from weaker to stronger. So remember that so far we have covered some definitions, basic definitions when we plan our M&E, right, for any program or project. And remember that we are implementing interventions, right? We're doing something. So we need all our measurements, and then we add them and put them, in a matrix, right? That has levels and sequences. And then we have indicators, and of course we need to know exactly what they are. And then we've also looked at data, and so what we're going to measure, right? And also there's different types of data, and of course quantitative, qualitative, and of course we've even looked at where are we going to get them from: the population, from services, from facilities, from organizations, etc. So all these we have covered now. But now let's see, and let's think, if we are to report some results and we think they are good, okay? How do we respond to the question? Somebody in the audience, raises a hand and says, well, how do we know those results are because of your intervention, right? And not that, after using all this time, and also the donors will say all this money, how do we know that this was not going to happen anyway? Ooh, well, what a question. Or worse, that someone comes and says, hey, I've seen in the neighborhood of the place that you've worked some similar results with no interventions, or maybe with fewer interventions, or less money, etc., or less time. That would be a critical position to be in, and of course you have to know what to answer, and how, and that's why we need to talk about how do we demonstrate that it's not only good results, but it's our results, and how do we say yes, otherwise there wouldn't be anything, or there wouldn't be as much good results as we are showing you. So this is where we need a design. So whatever we're going to measure, this is where we have again one key term that we have used in previous chapters, which is compare. Everything when we evaluate needs comparisons, so now more than ever. So we need to compare, right? Remember that we have used time, we have used funds, and depending on the support that you have, you can also go and do different types of design. But most importantly, once again, these other critical terms that we have reviewed, over time, there's going to be what? There's going to be change. And that's why we're measuring, because we need to demonstrate, we need to show that there was change, okay? And that's why we have, remember, our baselines. And this is where we start thinking, well, how about we compare against another area, right? And that's going to be called, if we say compare, we can call it a comparison group. But in research and evaluation, we have the word control. So we have a control group, okay? So now we have two types, where we have our, if you like, call it, an experiment. You have the experimental side, and then you have the control side, or you have the action group, the intervention group, and then you have your control group, okay? So remember that. Okay, and we're going to show you this graph that I have prepared, which is an adaptation of, years ago, of a, of a chart that was done by Fisher et al., from Population Council. And I've used it for, what we're going to say today. So there is there is this graphic, and I'm showing you where you have, in this graphic you have, how do you, in your design, how do you have from less of a strength, from a weaker design to a stronger design. And okay, so that's in the y-axis. In the x-axis we have time, we have something that we will call the baseline or the starting point, and then obviously the finish line, the end line. That's why we have baseline and end line, okay? And over time we have the intervention, okay? That's going to be the excess you're going to see there. So we're going to cover all that. Okay, so very important that we need to have a control group Y. So let's review the basis for that. It's because, remember, nothing in the world is static, even more so nowadays, right, than in the past. Why? Because we have media, we have, before there was only radio and then TV, and now we have all this, social media, and so there's always lots of communication. So people know things over time, and if you have an intervention that may have some implication on what people know, even what people do, behavior, but that might be based on something they find out on their own or through other means rather than your means, then you have to have all that in mind, right? So big, and that's where what we are thinking, okay, there was nothing, on the other group. Let's stop short there and realize, hey, maybe it's not that there's nothing, but there's something. There's a base. So there's a base, things that happens everywhere. Okay, but our intervention is going to show what additional effects there are. So it's above and beyond that base. Okay, so very important, because other things can happen. And this is called a counterfactual, meaning there's, in these other places, there are also facts that are occurring, and that might make things change, even if you have not applied your intervention there. Okay, so they're very important. Okay, and so very, very tricky. So the counterfactual, and then the important thing is that there could be also other things occurring in the other group. Why? Let's also remember that before, years and centuries ago, when there were interventions, people were not sure whether they were going to result, in being positive. So before, you could have a group that was where nothing was done, but nowadays, that could be unethical. Why? Because for some interventions, we know that there's gonna be positive benefits. It's going to be beneficial to the group. So nowadays, it's tricky not to have anything done on the other group, the control group. And that's why nowadays sometimes the group is intervention A versus intervention B. In other words, you want to say that your intervention A is better than you had an intervention B, which might be another type of implementation of actions, right? But where you want to say, okay, this is even better. So now it's getting a bit more complex, because now you have to subtract, and that's going to be part we're going to talk in some other chapter. When your results, you have to subtract the results in the control group, or in the B group, if you like, or in the graphic we call it A1 or A2 group, because they have also, say, improved in your critical measures, remember, in your indicators. Okay, so this is very interesting. So let's go and review, and I'm going to try and see if I can, with you, if we can go and look at those things on the other side. And this is where you can see, and I'm going to show you as we discuss how we go from the weaker to the stronger research design, research and evaluation designs, right? And this is over time, of course. So here in the left, we have the beginning. So we have, our, group as we begin and as we measure. And then, of course, over time, we have the intervention X, and then obviously from A to Z, right? So the end line, or time 2, if you like, time A and time 2, which is at the end of it. So if we look at the design, different types of designs, we have something called post-test only. Why? Because there was no measurement. Maybe you were not able to. Maybe you started doing M&E. You were hired here at this point, or here, and so sometimes, and this has happened to me, right? That you find that you have only a chance of measuring things at the end. Okay. So this is obviously very weak, because you talk about compare. What are you going to compare with? And so unfortunately, you cannot compare. But remember that there's always ways of doing things. And remember, for example, once I did this, even at the very end of things, can I retroactively try and find out what was there before, right? There might be some biases, of course. People conceptualize and rationalize and try to or some people have, remember, there's memory biases. Some people might not remember what was there before, especially if it's a long time. But the most and the more you can to find out what was there at the beginning, so at least you have, even if retrospectively, some information. The next one, of course, the next level up in from weaker to stronger, is when you have that chance of having your pre-test and your post-test, right? So you have your intervention. So you know that how things were at the very beginning, at the start, and then at the end. But of course, you can see in these instances, you don't have a control group. You're not comparing against another similar group. And then you have another one, which is a time series. This is a bit stronger in that, yes, you are not comparing against others, but at least over time, you are comparing your interventions. It makes it stronger, because even if somebody might object and say, hey, is this really your doing? Here you have more measurements, and so you're controlling more over time. And maybe here you can realize, hey, over time, every 6 months or 3 months or whatever, there is improvement in the place. And of course, the next level up is when we start. And look at that. It's so interesting, because you don't have a baseline. You don't have a starting point, but at least you were able. And remember, sometimes, you might be hired here, but maybe you can have the chance. And again, you need support for this. And we haven't talked about the budget that is required. But if you can, then you do, even if it's a post-test only, you can add another group. And the more you can, of course, now here there's a trick that is very important. In order for you to compare and say that the comparison is meaningful, always remember that your control group has to be as similar as possible. Remember, in the previous chapter, we were talking about how when you sample, you have to have to know the context of everything. And if you have a different social cultural environment, religious, ethnic, or even if one place is more rural than the other, and things are gonna the means are different, there's going to be changes related to those differences. So here you're going to try and have as close as possible, as similar as possible. Okay, and then in these last two more stronger designs, here is where and then you have the chance of having your control group at the very beginning, right? And of course at the end. All right. Now, interesting, because there is this terminology that is called non-randomized, but it's control, which means, again, consider that if you choose the place where you're going to have intervention and then you select purposely another similar group nearby on the next county, in the next district, but it's you have selected it, so there might be some selection biases there, or there's might be some differences here that you were not aware of at the beginning. Because why? Because there was this, you can see the legend on an NRA means non-random allocation. So but oftentimes this happens because you don't have the permission, you cannot do that, or it might even be unethical to do that. So you don't have that capacity. But the more you can prove, and that's why you measure both places, that both the comparison and the action or experimental group are as similar as possible, then of course you're going to be more secure, you're going to be more confident of your results. And of course, lastly, and at the top level, you have what we call the randomized allocation, which means that here you might even have just one group and you measure everything that happens in one group, and then you subdivide it randomly, and one is going to be A1 and one is going to be A2, and you're going to have one intervention in the X1 and the other intervention X2, right? In the past, and still sometimes you can have X1 as an intervention, X2 might be no intervention, or might be purposely that you want to leave it to social media to see how different is social media versus your social media, right? And then of course at the end you have Z, Z1, Z2, and this was a control. This previous one nowadays is called semi, right? Quasi-experimental, but this one on top is the experimental design, of course. And of course, each one will make things be more, you have more confident of the results or not. Okay, so this is very important. You're going to be studying this on your own. Now, it's important to mention a few things that can happen, and we're going to mention this. So what can happen here is that, remember that the two groups might be in the vicinity, the neighboring community or district. So they could be, without you being aware, perceiving it, there might be that people talk to each other, right? And then, I don't know, maybe once a month or once every period, there are people who travel to the other location, and if there's something that they can talk to other people, there might be what we call contamination. So you can spill over some of the interventions. So especially if it's psychological, psychosocial, there could be some contamination in that. They could be talking about, oh, you have not heard about this that they're doing in our communities, or why not in your communities? And so you might have to be very careful to see if you feel that there might be contamination, that try to avoid it. Okay. Now, of course, there's another thing talking about biases. When we talk about, even if it's randomized, there can be something that happens because we, as implementers, we might know who is our action group, our experimental group, and which is a control group. So sometimes, without realizing, you might put not only different more inputs or more attention, more concentration in one group versus the other, but at the time of evaluation, you might even evaluate differently. You can do things that might not be exactly at the time of measurement, and that's why there's especially in clinical trials, there's this thing called double blind because neither the subjects, the beneficiaries, know what has been given to them. Are they having the experimental dose or are they being controlled? Nobody knows. Especially in clinical, you have the medicines, you have the active pharmaceutical or whatever medicines or drugs are being tested, and then you have the placebo, which is something that's supposed to be very similar. If there is an injection, the other people are going to maybe see, well, you were not given an injection, or maybe you were given a placebo. So you have to make sure that things are given with the same means as well, and that's what we call the double blind, because neither the implementers or the researchers nor the recipients or the beneficiaries know what they are getting, what they are having, what are we getting the intervention, are we being controlled, etc. Okay, very interesting. And of course, there's other things that we don't have time to talk now more, but you can have a spread out community, or you can have clusters. So that depends on the specific type of designs, right? And only one final thing, and maybe I'll put also a graph so that you know that there is the typical that we have seen these two groups are like in parallel, but there's also something called step wedge, when you cannot leave the other group without treatment. And so what you do is you start with everyone being controlled, and slowly and gradually everyone, you have more and more people and groups from the other side who start becoming the experimental side. And so in the end, you have everyone getting that vaccine or that drug, those drugs, that intervention, okay? So this is very important, and each one has their pros and cons and their strengths and weaknesses, and also important that how you're going to analyze those. Okay, so that's for a basic coverage of what we wanted to on typical research and evaluations designs from weaker to stronger. Okay, so if you like, subscribe, and then we'll continue to cover more things about monitoring and evaluation made easy, M&EZ. Thanks very much.